Hello there tonight. We are going to slip quietly into the dark, candle-lit rooms of Tudor England. Imagine a house that smells of damp linen and old wood smoke, where servants murmur just beyond the heavy oak doors, and a girl not much older than 15 is being undressed by strangers under the watchful eyes of her new family. She's standing still, arms out like a doll, as they peel away silk and ribbon and lace until there's nothing left between her skin and the chill of the room but the thin shift she'll wear into bed. Her husband waits on the other side of the curtain. They may have spoken 10 words to each other today. Welcome to your wedding night. You probably won't survive. Not in the way you'd hope to. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The bedding ceremony was not just a tradition. It was a public ritual designed to humiliate, to expose, to confirm that the transaction had been made. Marriage was property. The woman, often no more than a girl, was part of that property. Her body was now someone else's responsibility. Consummation wasn't romantic, it was legal proof. No sex, no marriage. And witnesses, sometimes they stayed right outside the room. Sometimes they didn't even bother to close the door until the couple was tucked in. Imagine it. The rough hands tugging at sheets, the laughter fading down the hallway, the door finally shutting with a heavy thud. Now it's just the two of you, and he's expected to do his duty. Quickly, if possible. Blood on the sheets is best. Blood is proof. If there's no blood, well, you might have to fake it. Women learn the tricks early. A finger pricked beneath the covers, a sponge soaked in animal blood tucked beneath the thighs. Desperate measures for desperate futures. A stain of red meant survival, meant no one would whisper about your past, meant you could at least start your life as a wife without the shadow of scandal. Of course, historians still debate whether this was truly widespread practice or simply the stuff of clergy-fueled panic and court gossip. But the records we have speak volumes not of happiness, but of sheets displayed like trophies of mothers-in-law scrubbing linen for evidence of neighbors peering too eagerly through half-shut doors. And here's a fun off-topic fact. Tudor England had entire pamphlets printed about the right way to bed your wife. Illustrated too. Educational in the most mortifying way. Now let's go back to our girl beneath those scratchy sheets. She doesn't know what to expect. No one has explained the mechanics, only the consequences. Be obedient. Be silent. Don't make him angry. Yield. This is your role now. The man beside her may be gentle or he may not. He might mumble something awkward and kind. He might just close his eyes and get it over with. Either way, it's happening. The candles flicker. The ceiling looms. And afterward, she is supposed to sleep. Except she won't. Her body aches in places she didn't know existed. Her mind runs in panicked circles. Did she bleed enough? Did she make the right noises? Did she seem too eager or too cold? Did he notice how much she wanted to cry? And morning comes. With it comes scrutiny. In-laws, servants, the church, everyone waiting to see if the bride passed her unspoken test. She smiles. She lies. She says she's happy. And maybe she prays to forget. You see, in Tudor England, the marriage bed wasn't a sanctuary. It was a courtroom, and the verdict was already written. A woman's worth lay in blood, in silence, in submission. No one asks how she feels. That was never the point. The next night it will happen again. And the next, until a baby comes or a scandal does. This is how her life begins. Not with love, not with tenderness, but with expectation, observation, and the unspoken terror of what happens to women who fail to please. She closes her eyes, tries to breathe, wonders if this is what being a wife truly means. and somewhere deep down a small voice whispers, "Survive this night, then survive the next, one at a time, because no one is coming to save you." The scrutiny didn't end with the first night. In Tudor England, a woman's body was never entirely her own. Once married, it belonged to her husband in name and law, and more disturbingly, in the eyes of everyone around her. It wasn't just about whether she had bled on the sheets or cried softly into her pillow. It was about how she walked the next day, how she held herself at breakfast, how she spoke or didn't speak. There were people watching for the smallest signs. A limp, a wince, a certain tilt of the hips, all could betray what had happened in the darkness, or what hadn't. And if there was no child within the year, well, whispers travel faster than horses. Tudor households were dense little ecosystems of gossip and observation. Maids, mothers-in-law, midwives, servants, everyone had opinions, and everyone felt entitled to share them. A woman who didn't conceive quickly might be judged barren-cursed, or simply too frigid to rouse a proper man. A woman who looked too happy after her wedding night might be suspected of prior experience. These weren't private matters. They were communal concerns, because a woman's body was tied to inheritance, to property, to bloodlines. Her success or failure was public business. Of course, historians still debate whether ordinary people truly lived under this constant microscope, or whether such stories come to us distorted by the wealthy, the powerful, the ones whose beds and bellies mattered most. But even in the humblest village, a childless marriage drew stares. It wasn't just about childbirth. It was about control. Physical, spiritual, and even anatomical. The obsession with virginity didn't end when a woman was married. It simply morphed into an obsession with purity, obedience, and proof. There were tests. Ridiculous, humiliating, invasive tests. Midwives called in to examine bodies they had no business examining, searching for signs of tightness, for the mythical hymen, for anything that might confirm or deny a woman's worth. And if science couldn't find answers, superstition gladly filled the void. Some believed a woman's walk could betray her. A shuffle meant innocence. A strut suggested experience. Even how she carried herself could be cause for suspicion. Too pale, hiding shame. Too flushed, hiding secrets. Too outspoken, clearly hiding everything. There's a strange little fact for you. Tudor-era physicians, not content with monitoring the womb, also thought they could diagnose a woman's chastity through urine samples. Cloudy pale with certain sediments, probably impure. Probably lying. And if a woman didn't bleed on her wedding night, if she didn't conceive quickly, if her body didn't cooperate with expectation, there were accusations waiting. Witchcraft was the favored scapegoat. Only a witch, they said, could trick a man into thinking she was pure when she wasn't. Only a witch could close her womb to rightful seed. Only a witch could bring such shame into a household. So women learned to perform. To fake frailty, to feign modesty, to master the art of seeming smaller than they were. They practiced how to walk without suspicion, how to laugh softly enough, to be thought innocent but not bold enough to be thought wanton. They learned which neighbors to trust and which to fear. They learned above all to keep secrets, secrets passed from mother to daughter, from midwife to bride. How to fake a blush, how to hide a stain, how to produce blood when blood would not come, how to whisper prayers to saints and ancestors and anyone who might listen, how to survive a world where even your own body could be turned against you. The church didn't help. In sermons, in confessionals, in the quiet manipulations of daily life, it reinforced the idea that a woman's flesh was dangerous, that her body was a battleground between virtue and vice, between heaven and hell, that her purity was not just her burden, but her entire family's honor. And so while her husband might return to the tavern bragging or complaining, She returned to her chamber in silence, wondering how much of herself she could lose before there was nothing left. A curious little fact here. While chastity belts are often associated with this era, most historians agree they were more myth than reality jokes. Curiosities not widely used instruments of control. But sewn-up shifts, locked doors, reinforced undergarments, those were very real. Control took many forms. Locks, lectures, lingering hands where they weren't wanted. Suspicion became a kind of currency traded among women and weaponized by men. And through it all, the woman walked carefully, spoke softly, kept her head down. Because anything else might invite scrutiny, and scrutiny invited ruin. There was no privacy. Not really. Not when your body was discussed over church pews and washing lines. Not when your fertility was debated like market prices. Not when your worth could be weighed by blood, by birth, by breath itself. So you learned to survive. To measure every step, every word. To endure. Because endurance was the only path forward. You did not own yourself. You belonged to the watchers, and they were always watching. At night, beneath the heavy blankets and the heavier expectations, there was no escape. What happened between those sheets wasn't just private, it wasn't private at all. It was scrutinized, legislated, moralized, sermonized. It was supposed to happen only one way for one reason, and only in a posture deemed acceptable by men who had likely not touched a woman in decades. Pleasure was not the goal. Pregnancy was. Pain was expected. Silence was preferred. The church had an entire theology dedicated to the bedroom, and none of it was designed for comfort. Sex, they said, was necessary but shameful. Holy but humiliating. A duty, a task, a grim necessity for the continuation of lineage. Anything beyond that desire, enjoyment, curiosity was considered sinful even within marriage. Missionary position only. Man on top. Woman beneath. Eyes to the rafters. Anything else hinted at corruption, at diabolical influence. Historians still debate whether these rules were truly followed behind closed doors, or whether couples simply nodded along and then did as they pleased. But in public and sermons, the message was clear: deviation was damnation. There were manuals, actual printed lists of forbidden acts, forbidden days, forbidden times. Wednesdays, Fridays, Sundays, risky. Lent out of the question. Advent, absolutely not. Feast days, never. Wanting it too much. Sinful, sneezing in the wrong direction. Well, best not to tempt fate. One curious little fact. Tudor medical advice occasionally suggested that too much pleasure during conception might result in a deformed child. So if you laughed, if you sighed, if you arched your back just a little too eagerly, blame yourself for the clubfoot or the lazy eye 9 months later. Men weren't spared from this tangled theology either. They were told from boyhood that their urges were sinful unless tightly controlled, directed only at their lawful wives and only in the prescribed manner. A man who strayed from this path risked not just his soul, but his household's reputation. And yet women bore the weight of suspicion more heavily. A woman's body was considered inherently more carnal, more temptable, more dangerous. Eve's legacy. Always one apple away from disaster. If a man sinned, it was because a woman tempted him. If a woman sinned well, she was likely already in league with darker forces. And so, under the blankets in the dark, women learned to lie still, to fake indifference, to make themselves small and silent and obedient. They learned to perform purity, to feign submission, to keep their thoughts locked away where no priest or husband could pry them loose. But even this performance was exhausting and dangerous, because sometimes silence wasn't enough. If a husband couldn't perform, the blame often fell on his wife. Too cold, too intimidating, too hostile in her womb. A man's failure could be explained by curses, by witches, by an ill-placed glance. A woman's failure, hers alone. Midwives whispered folk remedies for tightening the body, restoring purity, tricking the senses. Pomegranate seeds, rose petals pressed between thighs, cold baths, tight bindings. None of it worked, of course. But desperate women clung to desperate hopes, because sometimes a single red stain meant the difference between survival and scandal. The church weighed in as always. Women were to be receptive, passive, yielding. They were to accept pain without complaint, to endure discomfort with gratitude. To suffer in silence because that suffering was holy. If your body hurt, that was the price. If your heart broke, offer it up to God. If your mind rebelled, repent. There were no therapists, no sympathetic ears, only confessionals where shame was amplified, not eased. Only sermons where obedience was praised and questions condemned. So women whispered to each other in kitchens, in gardens, over bundles of herbs. Midwives became the secret keepers, the quiet educators, the only ones who truly listened. They knew the aftermath of ignorance, the bruises, the tears, the stillbirths. They knew the risks and the remedies, though many of those remedies were laced with superstition rather than science. Lie on your right side for a boy, your left for a girl. Warm thoughts for a son, cold for a daughter. Press this herb here. Drink this tea there. Not knowledge, not really, but knowledge enough to give the illusion of control. Because control was in short supply, even sounds were policed. Moans could be mistaken for demonic influence. Too much pleasure, a succubus at work. Better to stay quiet. Better to stay still. You began to police yourself, your thoughts, your breath, your heartbeat. You tiptoed through marriage like it was a confessional. Every act weighed, every desire questioned. Always the same dull message echoing beneath it all. This isn't for you. It's for God, for family, for property. Not for your pleasure, certainly not for your voice. You learned to fold yourself smaller, to disappear beneath layers of linen and lace, beneath sermons and suspicion. You became a ghost in your own marriage, a vessel, a duty, a quiet figure beneath a sagging canopy of carved oak. And still you survived, because there was no other choice. Childbirth for a Tudor woman was not a moment of triumph. It wasn't a celebration of new life, not really. It was the final exam you had been preparing for since your first bleeding. The moment you either proved your worth to your husband, your household, and your God, or you didn't come back from the birthing room at all. The birthing chamber was not a place of science. It was a place of ritual, of folklore, of whispered prayers and sweat-soaked fear. The walls closed in around you, dark, hot, silent, but for the rustle of skirts and the muted murmur of women who had seen this before, and might see it again before the week was out. No men allowed. Not even the husband, unless things went so catastrophically wrong that he was called in to say goodbye. The midwife ruled here. A woman of experience, not education. She had no degrees, no formal training, but she carried with her generations of knowledge stitched into her apron. Herbs for the nerves, charms for the pains, sharp scissors for the final moment. She had seen death more often than the village priest. Sometimes she helped a life begin. Sometimes she simply helped it end cleanly. And the mother-to-be, she had no control. Not over her body, not over the outcome. She had done her duty, she had lain beneath her husband, silent and still, and now she reaped what came of it. If she survived, she might be praised for her obedience. If she didn't, well, at least she had fulfilled her role to the bitter end. Before labor began, she might have been given a birthing girdle, an embroidered cloth worn around the waist, etched with prayers to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Holy relics might be placed beneath the bed, candles lit, incantations murmured. Anything to tilt the odds in her favor. Historians still debate whether these rituals offered any true comfort or merely a cruel illusion of control. But what else did a woman have? And here's your odd fact of the night: some women stitched their own burial shrouds while pregnant, just in case. Labor could last hours, days, no anesthesia, no real medical help, no escape. If the baby came wrong, breech twisted, tangled in its own cord, the midwife did what she could with what she had. Sometimes that meant saving the child at the cost of the mother. Sometimes neither could be saved. You might scream. You might beg. You might be told to bite a strap of leather and think of the Virgin Mary. You might be told that pain was holy, was cleansing, was part of God's plan. And afterward, if you lived, you would bleed for weeks. You would ache in ways no one dared speak of. Your belly would sag, your body stretched beyond recognition. Your husband might look at you differently. So might your neighbors, because now you were truly a woman. Not before, not on your wedding night. Only now, with proof in blood and pain, and perhaps a squalling infant in your arms. If the child survived, more scrutiny awaited. Was it strong? Was it healthy? Did it look like its father? Did it cry too much? Did it not cry enough? Any deviation might be read as a sign of sin, of punishment, of failure. And if the child was stillborn, if it died within days, weeks, months, the blame rarely fell on fate. It fell on you. What had you eaten? What had you thought? Had you been too angry, too vain, too fearful? Had you tempted the devil? Had you spoken of the pregnancy too soon, inviting evil spirits to your door? There were whispers, there were looks, there were punishments, sometimes harsh, sometimes silent, but punishments all the same. A woman who lost a child might be marked for life. Unlucky, unfit, unclean. You learn to hold your grief inside like breath beneath water. To smile, to nod, to say yes, yes, God's will. To try again, and again, and again. Until your body gave out, or your womb finally produced the heir everyone was waiting for. Because fertility wasn't just expected, it was demanded. A woman who could not bear children might face annulment, abandonment, or worse. Her husband might seek a mistress, blaming her coldness for his straying. Or he might petition for freedom on grounds of barrenness, and the courts would side with him. A curious detail: powdered antlers, crushed pearls, and other absurd concoctions were recommended to improve fertility. Dangerous, ineffective, desperate. But when your worth hung on your womb, you tried anything. And when you failed, you carried the shame alone. No one asked how you felt. That was never the point. So you stitched another shroud, lit another candle, prayed another prayer, and waited to see if this time you would live long enough to need it. Infertility in Tudor England wasn't a private sorrow, it was a public scandal. A woman's womb was not her own. It was her duty, her proof of value, her husband's property, and the subject of endless invasive speculation. If no child came within a year of marriage, people noticed. They whispered. They judged. Your belly was watched. Your complexion scrutinized. Were you eating less? Were you weeping more? Every shift in mood or body became evidence one way or another. And if the months passed, if the blood kept coming when it should have stopped, the verdict was swift, barren, broken, useless. Of course, Tudor medical knowledge was laughable at best. Physicians, those lucky few with actual training, clung to ancient theories of humors: hot, cold, wet, dry. Women by nature were deemed cold and wet. A womb that refused to quicken was thought to be too cold, too slippery, too hostile to seed. Remedies included hot baths, bitter herbs, fasting leeches. Yes, leeches. Because why not add bloodletting to your growing list of miseries? Historians still debate whether women believed these treatments worked or whether they submitted because they had no choice. But what is certain is this: the blame always settled on the woman. A man's failure surely caused by her. Too cold, too haughty, too unnatural. A woman's failure, proof of her insufficiency in every possible way. And if she couldn't produce a child, her future darkened. An annulment loomed. Not divorce. Tudor England didn't offer that luxury, but a nullification, as if the marriage had never existed. A clean slate for him, a lifetime of shame for her dowry gone, her reputation ruined. Even more humiliating were the whispers of witchcraft. A woman who thwarted her natural purpose must be meddling with dark forces. Perhaps she cursed her own womb, or worse, her husband's manhood. Tales spread of women who could cause impotence with a glance, who brewed potions to steal fertility, who bore the devil's mark somewhere beneath their corsets. A curious fact: some believed infertility could be cured by carrying a dried weasel heart in your shoe. Romantic, isn't it? Desperate women tried anything. Poppy seed concoctions, owl's eggs buried beneath doorsteps, amulets tied beneath skirts. Others faked pregnancies for as long as they could, padding their bellies, inventing cravings, retreating behind closed doors until it became impossible to sustain the lie. A miscarriage, they would say, voice trembling with practiced grief. Nature's cruel trick. And sometimes there were miscarriages. More often than not. Poor nutrition, disease, brutal winters, and sheer misfortune robbed countless women of their hope. Yet no one blamed fate. They blamed the mother. Too emotional, too sinful, too eager. Had she eaten pickled plums during Lent? Had she gazed too long at another man? Had she thought dark thoughts beneath the moon? All possible causes. The shame was relentless. A body that betrayed you marked you as a traitor. Folk healers offered alternatives, elixirs, charms, even whispered spells written in blood. Powdered pearls swallowed by the desperate. Cold baths endured in agony. Some women turned to more dangerous measures. Tansy rue pennyroyal herbs known to provoke bleeding, sometimes used to avoid a pregnancy, sometimes to force one. Overused, they could kill. Sometimes they did. Historians debate how many women knew exactly what they were risking. How many acted in hope, in fear, in defiance. How many simply wanted control over something, anything, when their lives left them so little. If a husband truly wanted heirs, he might seek them elsewhere. Quiet affairs, bastards born in shadowed rooms. If the mistress conceived, the wife's fate was sealed. Barren, broken, replaced. Even if the marriage endured, her standing would not. A cracked vessel, a dry field. A cautionary tale whispered over ale and sewing circles. So she sat by the hearth, pressing coins to her belly, reciting prayers to saints grown deaf from centuries of pleading. She watched other women swell and birth and cradle and wondered what sin she had committed to deserve this emptiness. Another curious fact: it was said a woman could conceive if she swallowed powdered stag antlers mixed with wine. Useless, of course. But hope is stronger than reason when your worth is measured in swelling bellies and crying infants. Some stopped counting days. Some stopped speaking of it at all. Others grew bitter. Others silent. All lived beneath the weight of expectation, of failure, of fear. Because in Tudor England, a woman without a child was not a woman at all. She was a question mark, a suspicion, a failure in a world that offered no room for second chances. For the rare woman who survived her marriage, her childbirths, and her children's childhoods, the twilight of her life in Tudor England did not promise rest. Old age did not bring safety. If anything, it brought suspicion. A woman without a husband, without sons to speak for her, without the shield of fertility to make her useful, she was a danger to the order of things. Widows were tolerated barely, respected sometimes, feared often, because an older woman, especially one with a sharp tongue or too many herbs drying in her rafters, was unsettling. She had outlived her usefulness. She knew things. She didn't fear the rules the way a young bride might, and that made her dangerous. It began with whispers. A sheep miscarried near her fence. A child fell ill after accepting a sweetmeat from her hand. A husband grew cold, limp, distant. Who to blame but the woman who lived alone with her secrets and her herbs? Historians still debate how much these accusations were rooted in genuine belief versus social control. Likely it was both. Fear and convenience make fine partners. The accusations of witchcraft weren't sudden. They brewed slowly like storm clouds over damp fields. A look held too long. A quarrel remembered too well. A recipe shared that soured instead of sweetened. A neighbor's bad luck, a baby's fever, a husband's impotence linked by nothing but need for explanation and the ready availability of a woman to blame. Curious fact. For tonight, Tudor women sometimes wore garlic in their shoes or tied rowan twigs to their aprons to ward off accusations of witchcraft. Protection by association. A charm against the cruel logic of fear. And so the widow, the crone, the healer, the woman who knew when to plant and when to reap, learned to move quietly, to speak softly, to offer no unsolicited advice, to keep her remedies hidden behind baskets of lavender and loaves of bread, because survival meant silence. The church watched, the courts listened, the neighbors talked, a blemish mistaken for the devil's mark. A birthmark read as a pact signed in blood. A mole, a freckle, a scar proof enough if the suspicion already burned hot. You might be stripped and searched, your hair shaved, your body examined by those who claimed to seek truth, but only hungered for confirmation. You might face trial, not by evidence but by rumor, not by logic but by fear. Audrey down the lane couldn't read, couldn't defend herself. They shaved her head, found a mole near her ribs, proof enough. Banished, not burned. Lucky, they said. But luck runs out. Your home grew colder, your hearth quieter. Children crossed themselves when you passed. Men averted their eyes. Women whispered behind their hands. You lowered your gaze, bit your tongue, waited for time to finish what it had started. Because no one wanted to admit the truth, an old woman was feared, not for what she lacked, but for what she had survived. She had lived through blood and birth and loss. She had buried husbands and children and dreams. She had carried secrets stitched into hems and tucked into jars. She knew too much, spoke too little, asked too few favors. And knowledge in the hands of a woman was dangerous currency. Midwives, herbalists, widows. They held power in quiet ways. The right herb for fever. The right tea for a restless babe. The whispered charm to ease a troubled night. They knew when to act, when to wait, when to disappear. But even this small power was suspect. A child's cough, a cow's dry teat, a spoiled vat of ale. Who better to blame than the woman who had outlived decency, propriety, and usefulness? The church courts needed scapegoats. The village needed peace. The law needed examples. And so you learned to protect yourself in small, pitiful ways. Rowan berries hung above the door. Salt sprinkled beneath the threshold. A Bible always open, a prayer always half-whispered. Enough to seem harmless. Enough to seem holy. Never enough to truly be safe. Because the line between wise and wicked was perilously thin. Your husband, if he still lived, might soften with age, or harden further, bitter at your endurance, your quiet strength. He might resent the years, etched in your face, the silences you kept too well. Or he might fear you as others did, because he knew how little of his power remained. And you tended him out of duty, out of habit, out of some small, stubborn kindness that refused to die. You watched the seasons turn, watched your hands stiffen with age, watched the world grow colder, faster, sharper around you, and you learned how to move through it without drawing attention, how to speak just enough, how to smile without revealing too much, how to vanish while standing in plain sight. They might call you good wife still, but behind closed doors, your name was something else. Question, warning, threat, a woman who had lived too long, known too much, smiled too calmly through too many storms. You were no longer afraid, but everyone else was. Obedience became its own kind of armor. Over the years, it hardened around you like another layer of skin, something you learned to wear the way you wore your apron, your headdress, your carefully measured smile. Obedience wasn't about virtue, not really. It was about survival. In Tudor England, a woman's safest rebellion was silence. You learned to keep your head bowed at the right angle, your voice low, your laughter softer still. You learned how to agree without speaking, how to refuse without words, how to disappear within the folds of your own household. A ghost haunting the very life you were expected to live. It wasn't just about pleasing a husband, though, that mattered. It was about pleasing everyone. Your neighbors, your in-laws, the parish priest, the midwife who might one day save you or condemn you depending on how kindly you'd greeted her at market. Even the servants watched and weighed your worth. The household wasn't just where you lived, it was where you were judged every day by everyone. Historians still debate whether Tudor women believed this obedience was sacred or simply necessary. Did they internalize the sermons, the scripture, the silent expectations? Or did they learn quietly to navigate them without believing a word? Behind closed doors, small rebellions took root. A sachet of rosemary tucked beneath a pillow to ease bad dreams. A charm scratched into the hearthstone when no one was looking. A bitter herb brewed not for healing, but for control over a cycle, over a body, over a future that felt endlessly out of reach. Folk wisdom passed down, not in books, but in glances and whispers between women, in the careful stitching of secrets into the hems of skirts. Here's your odd fact for the night. Some Tudor women believed that inserting cold stones before the wedding night could preserve their virginity, locking it in place like a treasure no man could steal. Nonsense, of course, but desperation makes fools of us all, and so you endured. Through births and deaths, through seasons and scandals, through the endless cycle of expectation and disappointment. You learned that purity wasn't a moment. It was a performance, ongoing, relentless, measured daily in how you moved, how you spoke, how you existed. You bathed in vinegar and rosewater, sprinkled salt in your bath to ward off sin. You fasted after sex to cleanse your soul, or so they said. You avoided mirrors, lest vanity betray you. You kept your hands folded, your legs closed, your thoughts quieter than your prayers. Because even in marriage, your purity wasn't assumed. It had to be demonstrated, maintained, reinforced with ritual and restraint. And if you faltered, if you laughed too loudly, walked too boldly, met a man's gaze too directly, there were consequences. Small at first, a glance, a silence, a rumor. Then larger, a coldness in the household, a distance from neighbors, a question posed too casually by the priest. Reputation was everything. Once tarnished, it rarely recovered. A woman's virtue wasn't just her own, it was her family's standing, her household's honor, her husband's pride. And it was fragile, a cracked vessel, a frayed thread. You learned the dance well. When to speak, when to hold your tongue. When to cry, when to smile. When to step forward, when to shrink away. And in the quiet spaces, you found your own power. Not loud, not defiant, But there beneath the surface, a knowledge passed from woman to woman hidden beneath layers of submission. How to keep a child alive with herbs when doctors failed. How to ease a neighbor's pain with a whispered prayer. How to protect yourself even if only in the smallest ways. Some women brewed tea laced with valerian or poppy to calm an angry husband. A pinch in his ale, a drop in his stew. Nothing deadly. Just enough to dull the edge to make the night pass more easily. A sleepy man was a peaceful house. Resistance didn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looked like survival, like endurance, like knowing where the bruises would bloom before they did, like knowing which doors creaked and which steps could be skipped without waking him, like knowing how to disappear without ever leaving the room. You became an expert in absence. Even in presence, you learned how to make yourself smaller, quieter, less, until there was nothing left to take from you that you hadn't already given up. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of linen and lace and duty, beneath the bowed head and the bitten tongue, something remained. A sliver of self untouched by sermon or scrutiny. A part of you that remembered how to smile when no one was watching. A part that whispered, "I am more than this." You learned to listen to that voice. Not loudly, not recklessly, but enough. Enough to light a candle when you needed warmth. Enough to hum a song when silence became too heavy. Enough to pass down your quiet knowledge to daughters and nieces and girls who hadn't yet learned how heavy a life could feel when carried beneath layers of expectation. Because one day you knew they would need it, and you would be ready to whisper it to them in kitchens and gardens beneath the hush of a sleeping house. The rules could silence you, but they could not unmake you. Not entirely. At the end of it all, there was still the bed. Different, perhaps, from the one you'd first been placed in on your wedding night, this one lower, harder, less grand. The curtains hung thinner now, if there were any at all. The mattress sagged, smelled faintly of herbs and old sweat and vinegar. But it was still a bed, and it was still not yours. Not really. You had lain beneath men, beneath sermons, beneath expectations. You had birthed children who lived and children who didn't. You had folded yourself into silence so often you forgot the shape of your own voice. You had obeyed. You had survived. And now you waited to die. Death was the one thing you might call your own. The bed you died in would be yours finally in a way no bridal bed had been. No husband would claim this moment. No priest would chart its timing or technique. No mother-in-law would inspect the sheets afterward. You could go as you pleased, quietly, without ceremony, without performance. There was a kind of relief in that. Women prepared for their own deaths, the way they prepared for everything else, quietly, diligently, with a resigned sense of duty. Some commissioned their coffins in advance, measured for boards and shrouds, with the same care they once applied to their daughters' dowries. Some chose the prayers to be read, the psalms to be sung, the herbs to be burned. Control at last. A small, stubborn claim staked in the earth. You might wonder, lying beneath thin blankets, if any of it mattered. If the obedience had won you peace. If the silence had spared you pain. If anyone would remember you as more than a wife, a mother, a body beneath another's hand. Historians still debate whether these women found comfort in faith or simply habit. Did they die believing in the promises of heaven, or simply weary of the weight of living? But in the final hours, none of that mattered. What mattered was the hush of the room, the flicker of the candle, the slow rhythm of your own breath. The voices that had judged you, neighbors, priests, husbands, midwives, had fallen silent. The hands that had held you down, pushed you aside, guided you through doorways and deliveries, no longer reached for you. The watchers had turned their eyes elsewhere. There was only you, and the steady unwinding of time. Perhaps you thought of the girls who would come after. The daughters, nieces, servants, strangers who would stand where you had stood, who would learn the same rules and fight the same silent wars. Perhaps you pitied them. Perhaps you envied them. Perhaps you wished absurdly that you could warn them, be careful, be quiet, be kind to yourself when no one else will. Perhaps you simply closed your eyes and let it go, because at last, no one was watching. No one was listening. No one demanded a performance, a posture, a prayer. At last you belonged to yourself, and the house settled around you, stones cooling fire, dying shadows softening. Not a victory perhaps, but not a defeat either. Something quieter, something gentler, an ending, yes, but also a release. No more proving, no more bleeding, no more silence swallowed like stones, only stillness, only sleep. Tonight we've wandered through the long, quiet suffering of Tudor women, through wedding nights, framed as rituals of proof, through bodies inspected and judged by neighbors and midwives, through loveless beds and theologies that twisted desire into sin. We followed them into the terror of childbirth, into the crushing shame of infertility, into the slow suspicion that gathered around any woman who lived too long or too freely. We traced the invisible scars obedience left across generations. How silence became survival. How small acts of resistance lived beneath the weight of expectation. And at the end of it all, we came to rest beside her final bed. In the hush of a room no longer crowded by judgment, she finds the only peace Tudor England ever allowed her, a death unobserved. A body finally her own, a silence she chose. Tonight, let yourself drift into that same quiet. Let the weight of history soften. Let the candle burn low. Let the stories of women who survived slip away into the dark. There's no more watching, no more whispers, no more needing to be good enough. You're safe now, you're free now. Sleep well, sweet dreams.